It is never quiet on the Western Front as the Big Sky has replaced Sacramento State with the Southwest Utah duo, the Utah Tech Trailblazers, and the return of the Southern Utah Thunderbirds. From 90 years ago when they shared a league in the Intermountain, to today where they'll share a league once again in the Big Sky. A lot has changed over the last 9 decades. The schools have changed their school name, they've changed their team nickname, but what has not changed is they'll be in the same league yet again. The Southwest Utah region has been enjoying significant population growth. The St. George metropolitan area has grown from 48,000 population in 1990 to 207,000 population today. And the Cedar City micro statistical area has grown from 20,000 in 1990 to 65,000 today. Overall, both areas have grown by 15% in the last 4 years alone. The St. George MSA has grown by 50% since 2010, and Cedar City 43% since 2010, while St. George has more than doubled, growing by 130% since 2000, and Cedar City micro area by 95%. And finally, the St. George MSA has more than quadrupled since 1990, growing by 328%, while the Cedar City micro SA has more than tripled, growing by 217%. In fact, at one point, St. George was the fastest growing metro area in the United States. And that population boom in Southwest Utah has propelled both Southern Utah and Utah Tech to enrollment growth. 10 years ago, Utah Tech, then Dixie State, was at 8,500 enrollment. Now they're over 13,000. Meanwhile, Southern Utah was at 7,600 enrollment. Now they're at 15,400. In those 10 years, Southern Utah has doubled its enrollment, growing by 101.7%, while Utah Tech, their enrollment has grown by 53.6% over a decade. And that enrollment would put Southern Utah and Utah Tech 5th and 6th in the Big Sky, and they're only going upwards. One factor in the decision for the Big Sky might have been long-term membership insurance and sports sponsorship. If the Big Sky was considering the scenario where the Mount West could backfill with Montana and Montana State in the 2030s, that would leave them with 7 full members remaining, the bare minimum. However, keep in mind that if Montana and Montana State went FBS, then Northern Colorado might go to the summit. And if that were to be the case, then the Big Sky would fall below that required minimum of 7 full members. So by adding Southern Utah and Utah Tech, the Big Sky can still feel secure about their future even in a doomsday scenario. In the present day, if you look at men's golf and softball, the Big Sky was below the required minimum of 6. They were at 5 in both sports. And by adding Southern Utah and Utah Tech, that not only meets the minimum requirement of 6, but it also gives them a cushion of 7. Delving into athletic expenses using the Knight Commission database, there are 3 numbers here. The top number in black above the bars is their overall athletic expenses. The second number in those gray bars is how much of their athletic expenses are devoted to athletic student aid. And then the bottom number in those colored bars is how much of their athletic expenses are left over after you isolate that athletic student aid. Montana and Montana State would lead the way, and Utah Tech and Southern Utah, their athletic expenses would both fit right in the Big Sky. Now moving on to football budgets using the Knight Commission database, Montana State and Montana lead the way in a virtual tie, with Idaho, UC Davis, and Cal Poly rounding out the top 5. Southern Utah and Utah Tech would be at the bottom, but there's not much of a gap between them and the lower half of the Big Sky. Shifting to men's basketball expenses using the Department of Education database, Montana would be on top with Montana State second. Utah Tech and Southern Utah would come 7th and 8th in the Big Sky, so they would fit right in the lower half. Now here is my attempt at trying to figure out non-revenue sports travel. I'm presuming that all non-revenue sports would fly commercial, and that football and basketball would fly charter. First off, you have 3 schools, NAU, Weber State, and Idaho State, that can take bus trips to Utah Tech and Southern Utah. Northern Colorado can get a direct flight out of Denver to St. George, and then just bus to Utah Tech and Southern Utah. The other 5 schools, Portland State, Eastern Washington, Montana, Montana State, and Idaho, the airports they would go to for commercial flights don't have a direct flight to St. George, so they would likely utilize that airport to fly into Las Vegas and then bus from Las Vegas to Utah Tech and Southern Utah. If they don't want to take that long bus ride from Las Vegas, then they can do connecting flights to St. George via the Salt Lake City, Denver, or Phoenix airports. With the population explosion in St. George, the St. George Airport is undergoing an expansion. In June, the airport saw a 55% increase in passenger boardings compared to the same time last year. They haven't announced any new direct flight destinations yet, but who knows, those could come in the future. Southern Utah and Utah Tech have a rivalry going back to nearly a century ago, back when Southern Utah was the Branch Agricultural College Broncos, and Utah Tech was the Dixie Junior College Flyers. They played for the battle axe as far back as pre-World War II. They would describe the axe as the symbol they loved so much. The axe had metal bands added on each side of the handle, and they were engraved with the dates the schools were victorious. The two schools had to draw up a pact regarding the axe, as there were bad tastes still lingering in the mouths of both after misunderstandings. Here is an evolution timeline from the 1930s to today of both schools. Branch Agricultural College, BAC, eventually became Southern Utah, and Dixie Junior College eventually evolved into today Utah Tech. Southern Utah had been a 2-year school up until the 60s, and Utah Tech had been a 2-year school up until around 2000. They were both bitter rivals in the Intermountain Collegiate Athletic Conference, before reuniting recently in the WAC, and they'll reunite again in the Big Sky. The Thunderbirds were once the Broncos in their Intermountain days, while the Trailblazers were the Flyers and then the Rebels in their Intermountain days and eventually became the Red Storm before settling on Trailblazers. Both schools would join the Intermountain in 1936. On the Utah Tech side of this graphic, you can see an ICAC football in the school's trophy case. I took a picture of that. Southern Utah would leave the Intermountain in 63 and join the Rocky Mountain in 67. By 86, they would leave the Rocky Mountain, while Dixie State would join the Scenic West. Southern Utah would move up to Division I in 88 and join the American West in 94. They were once again a D1 independent in 96 before joining the Mid-Continent Conference in 97 that became the Summit League. Dixie State would move from the NJCAA to the NCAA Division II in 2006 and join the Pac West in 2007. Southern Utah would join the Big Sky in 2012. Dixie State would join the Rocky Mountain in 2018, and then move up to Division I and join the WAC in 2020. Southern Utah would join their old rival in the WAC in 2022, and come 2026, they will jump together to the Big Sky. First, we'll start off with Southern Utah's conference history. They would join the Intermountain in 1936 as Branch Agricultural College, BAC. As you can see, Dixie was also in that league, as well as Weber, until they dropped out around World War II, but then Weber would rejoin. And eventually Boise would join the Intermountain as Boise Junior College. Branch Agricultural College in 1953 would become Southern Utah, and they would spend 28 years in the Intermountain from 1936 to 1964. In 67, Southern Utah would join the Rocky Mountain Athletic Conference. Other schools in the Rocky Mountain Athletic Conference at that time would include Northern Colorado and Omaha, but they would eventually leave. Southern Utah would end up spending about 19 years in the RMAC until 1986 when they would depart. And a couple years later, in 1988, they would become a Division I independent. Southern Utah would be a Division I independent for about a half dozen years until 1994, when they would join the four-school American West Conference for a couple years, and then become a Division I independent once again for 1 year in 96-97. And by 97, Southern Utah would join the Mid-Continent Conference. They would win the 2001 Mid-Continent Tournament at the Allen County War Memorial Coliseum in Fort Wayne. The Mid-Con would eventually become the Summit League, and Southern Utah's 15-year run there would end in 2012, when Southern Utah would finally gain admission into the Big Sky, and they would stay in the Big Sky for a decade until 2022, when they shifted over to the WAC, and they would spend 4 years in the WAC, until 2026 when they will rejoin the Big Sky. As Dixie Junior College, they would join the Intermountain Collegiate Athletic Conference in 1936. Their arch rival Southern Utah was there for a while, as well as in-state Weber State. Boise State, who was then Boise Junior College, would also spend a considerable amount of time in the Intermountain. In all, Dixie would spend a half century in the Intermountain, a full 50 years, from 1936 to 1986. Dixie would follow up their 5 decades in the Intermountain with 2 decades in the Scenic West Athletic Conference. Utah Valley, another former junior college, was in that league with them. and Dixie would leave in 2006. When Dixie would move from the NJCAA to NCAA Division II, they would join the Pac West in 2007, where they were conference mates for a bit with Grand Canyon and Cal Baptist, and spent a total of 11 years there until 2018. At that point, Dixie shifted over to the Rocky Mountain Athletic Conference in 2018 for 2 years before departing in 2020 to move up to Division I via the WAC, where they reunited with Utah Valley and Southern Utah for 6 years, although Southern Utah was only there for 4 of them. And now in 2026, Utah Tech will get their ticket to the Big Sky. Unfortunately, I cannot speak to Southern Utah as I have not been there, but I have been to a game at what was then Dixie State. St. George has that famous whitewashed D, which stands for Dixie, and that dates all the way back to around 1914, 1915, when the classes of 1913 and 1914 were feuding about whose graduating class's number would be on that rock. If you ever go to a game at Utah Tech, definitely make a dinner around sunset at Cliffside Restaurant, part of your game day routine. You can sit outside and overlook St. George right as the sun goes down. But forewarning, make sure you call ahead of time and make a reservation. And here are some photos I took of Burns Arena. Here are photos I took of their trophy case inside. You can see an old ICAC football, Intermountain Collegiate Athletic Conference from 1963 in there. You can see 1962 Utah champs in football. You can see the score of a game over CSU. That CSU would have been College of Southern Utah back then. And there's also the 1985 Dixie College NJCAA National Champions. What was then the Rebels went 35-1. And here are more photos of the seating area of Burns Arena. An NBA preseason game was actually played here in 1988 with the Utah Jazz, with Karl Malone and John Stockton. And the game I went to had a pretty decent crowd of about between 2,000 and 3,000. It was a pretty rowdy bunch there. The student section, the Stampede, they were definitely into it. And when I move out west, in a matter of about 8 months, I'll definitely head out to Southern Utah and Utah Tech.